had the privilege of doing my doctoral studies at Aberdeen University in Scotland. Everybody wants to study in the Holy Land at some point. And I did not go over there with this topic in my back pocket. And through the wisdom of my advisor, John Drain and John Swinton, I discovered that this was something that was really, in a sense, eating away at me, to the point where at one point, one of my advisors asked me, Bill, are you mad at the church? And I didn't think I was, but I realized that there were things that I had been a part of as a pastor that I had to revisit. And one of those was how we look at our church buildings. As a pastor, I had been involved in about 2 or 3 building programs, and never once did theology come to the table. We talked about fiscal wisdom and feasibility and functionality and utilitarian approach to the building. As long as it kept the elements off and we had enough aesthetics to not be distracted, that's all we needed to do. It wasn't until I was asked to serve on a building committee at our church that one of my colleagues was also asked. He couldn't, but he said to the pastor at the time, whatever you do, make sure you have a theologian on the building committee. To which the pastor said, why? And I think back on that, my whole really view of our buildings basically up until that point. And as I studied this more, I came to realize that the built environment really does play an important part in the fulfillment of the mission of our church. I once had a conversation with a colleague where he made the comment, Bill, it doesn't matter where we worship, only that we worship. And for those of you that have joined in the conversation, I need to let you know I'm going to try to dismantle that as thoroughly as I can in our conversation today. And so it led me to this question, and it's a question I'd like to put up to those of you who have joined us. I would say that in the last 10 years, my view of church buildings, the built environment, sacred space, however you would like to put that, my view has changed, I think it's fair to say, radically. And what I'd be interested in knowing from my conversation partners here is how, if at all, how has your view of your church buildings changed in the last decade, in the last 10 years? If it has, how? If not, why not do you think that is? But I'd be interested in starting there, if that's okay. Sarah, with that question, how has your view of built environment, sacred space, church buildings changed in the last decade?
Great, thank you. So what I'm going to do at this point is you'll be invited to go into breakout rooms, and there'll be probably around 4 to 5 people in each room. And in that space, I invite you to introduce yourselves and address the question that Bill has offered us, which is how has your perspective on the built church environment changed in the last decade? And then after, I'll probably give you about 5 minutes for that conversation, which won't seem like very long, and everybody will need to be a little succinct in their comments. And then we will come back to this larger group and invite some representatives from each of the small groups to share kind of what surfaced in your conversation with each other. Okay, it looks like we are all back. I popped into a few rooms, excuse my voyeurism, and everybody seemed to be doing fine. So I wonder if we could have maybe one person from each group to just very briefly share if there were themes or things that came out from your group about how changing perspectives on the built church environment. So I will go to the first hand raise, and you can speak first. Is there someone willing to take on that role? Did you assign leaders? Okay, Ryan, go for it.
They decided on me speaking. So some of the different comments that were made as far as this go, some of the thoughts that a big theme was kind of the desire to look at space as being not just for a church congregation, but opening the space up to a community center and having even multiple congregations in that. And so looking at how space works in that way. Probably the other main thought, maybe just as far as some churches, I know myself and others sort of talk that this issue isn't really on the radar with most of the congregants. And so maybe it's something more of something that we've thought of, but others haven't. So I think that maybe summarizes our group.
Great, thanks, Ryan. Who would like to go next? Joel?
In our group, I think we've talked about a range of uses of congregational buildings to engage communities and as community hubs of all kinds of different services, as well as some of the tensions of aging buildings, large properties, what to do with that space, both economically, how do you engage people to attend, and so forth.
Great, thank you, Joel. Somebody else from another group. Anybody else? Okay, Andrew.
Let me just unmute. Yes, so from our group, there was, I'd say, consensus around the notion that the building's uses tend to sort of expand beyond the congregation itself. It was very much seen as a community space in most cases, and also talked about what I think Joel was saying, where there's sort of a confluence of different priorities and issues that need to be dealt with, emotional, spiritual, financial, and structural in some cases. Pressures come to bear, but I think more and more so the congregants are starting to become aware of it, and it's usually due to financial reasons that are forcing that. So there's no crisis until it's a financial crisis in a church. So there's a lot of good discussion that seems to be popping up more and more, and I think that can be used for good.
Great, thank you. And any other, I think we probably have at least one more group. Is someone willing to report back from that group? Okay.
Give it a shot. If March is not going to do it, I'll give it a shot. What we discussed in group 4 was the fact that some space, especially for young youth ministry, seems to be rather sterile and doesn't speak to them. And so perhaps we need to set aside space for them so it doesn't look just like your ordinary beige walls that's multifunctional. Perhaps they need their own space. And some space needs to be possibly maybe more challenging and more inviting, that confronts the person with an experience. So that's another way of going. And I mentioned that actually at my church, because my wife's a retired librarian and my daughter is a present librarian for the Eastern District of Prince Edward Island, that the library has the same problem as we have and is using the same hub model where multiple functions are happening. And we've moved way beyond the time of the librarian to it's actually noisy in there. And perhaps that hub model is exactly what we need for church as well.
Great. Thank you, Martin. So, Bill, we'll invite you to speak into this conversation. You've heard some of the themes that came out for folk. And the first piece that you're speaking to is the importance of place. So we'll turn the floor over to you. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. I had a conversation with a good friend while in Scotland, who found out that my dissertation was on the sacred space. He said to me, it's going to be very difficult to write 100,000 words on something that does not exist. So I asked him if he'd be willing to write the foreword for my book, which he didn't. But I wanted to address this whole issue. The place really is very, very important. And if you got the handout, what I'm looking at is a biblical perspective. It doesn't take very much effort to discover how important place is throughout Scripture, Old Testament and New Testament. Three things that I would highlight just because of time purposes. But one, when I look at creation, that's recorded for us in Genesis 1 through 3, the fact that God took the first 5 days, whatever that was, to create the cosmos before he put humanity in there, says to me the place was not really that important, and that's a notorious waste of creative energy on God's part. It says to me that right from the beginning of Scripture, place is paramount. We're not just spiritual beings. I'll say this again throughout, but life happens somewhere, and that somewhere is important. And we find that even back in Genesis, in the creation account. Could say more on that. But secondly, the incarnation of Christ speaks to me very powerfully about how in God's economy, place and space, and time and place and space are very important. God did not just give us the Word. He didn't just give us Scripture. He didn't just give us a spiritual experience. But as John says in John chapter 1, the Word became flesh. He dwelt in time, space, and place. I sometimes wonder about the time, like why he chose first century when he did. But I'll have to ask him that in glory. But the fact is that God himself chose to presence himself in a corporeal, a physical, spatial, locative, in a location, time. And thirdly, in the end, towards the end of John's Gospel, when Jesus was talking to his disciples, he said, I am going to prepare a place for you. And it's a Greek word, topos, from which we get topography. It's a location. That tells me that even though place was very important at the beginning of creation, in the life to come, we are still going to be in place. We will be in place, not just in some spiritual, ethereal existence, sitting on clouds, eating cream cheese or whatever it is, but we will be in a place with Jesus, with others. So when I look at those three aspects, those three biblical perspectives, creation, the incarnation, and the promise that Christ is going to prepare a topos, a place for us, that says to me that if we believe that, somehow or another, that should be reflected in the buildings we design and inhabit. What that means, well, we'll discover in our next section here. But let me stop there, Sarah, and see if there's any feedback, pushback, resonance, whatever. So the importance of place from the biblical, from creation, incarnation, and Christ's promise of the next life that we will be still in place.
So we'll take a kind of a brief kind of segue here and offer space if there's any folk that resonate with that or have questions around that. Feel free to kind of raise your hand and speak. And if we don't, we'll just move on to the next question, which is also wonderful. Okay, Bob?
You're talking about theology of space or place, but could that not be considered more than just for liturgy of the gathered community? Like, what does the theology of place look for the church to model to the whole community 24/7?
Thank you, Bob. That's a great question. And I have to agree with you. I think it goes beyond the ecclesial parameters of a church building. I mean, when you think about it, we function this way when it comes to our homes. For example, I would say to my wife, babe, I call her babe, and she's okay with that. Where the heart is. So it really doesn't matter what the house is like, okay? As long as we're together. as long as we love each other, home is where the heart is. My wife is going to have a reaction that will be probably hard for me to describe and probably wouldn't look good on camera. Because home is really important. The house is a reflection of the home. So we operate that way. Our home has my wife's signature all over it. You walk into our home, you will know certain things about our values, our view of aesthetics, our view of comfort, personal space, and all those things. So we do operate that way on a domestic level. What I'm saying is, why not on the church level as well? And why not beyond that? And I've been so intrigued to hear comments so far about the openness to others outside. I grew up in what I would call a fortress mentality. The church was the fortress. That's where we went to get out of the world, get away from the world. And now when I'm hearing you people say, but we ought to be open to the world, including our buildings. So I meandered off there a bit, Bob. I don't know whether to push back or if yes, want more clarity. If I answered your question, I'm not sure.
No, giving me things to think about and to write. Thanks.
Great.
Yep.
Any other questions or comments?
I had a question or a comment. I see, Bill, about the importance of place in the created environment and Jesus coming to dwell among us. And that seems to me an argument against virtual communities. It's about almost any place in God's created order is a good place to meet God. In the garden and out of the garden, the whole earth is his. And the key is that we are meeting with people and with God more than, as opposed to meeting virtually. So I'm just thinking of those arguments from Scripture. Are they an argument about meeting physically rather than an argument about buildings?
Oh, great question, Andrew. Thank you. Yes, I mean, I've been doing much thought subsequent to my journey into sacred space about the virtual world. In fact, I used to, if I can use the term, attend a church called Church of Fools that met every Sunday night at 7:30 Greenwich Mean Time online. You have an avatar. You go and you sit and you genuflect and you can talk to people. And they have a speaker. Tony Campolo spoke there one time. And they had a fat, bald Italian avatar for Tony Campolo. And I had conversations with people saying, is there not a danger in the virtual realm of dehumanizing us by relegating the body, the physical aspect of our being together with other people, to the incidental or secondary? And I would argue, yes, it does come dangerously close to that. So we need places. Now, it's interesting. A survey was done of people who attend virtual churches. 80% of them also attended offline, real churches. So the fear that this is going to empty all the churches, they're going to hemorrhage and everybody's going to go online. That's just not happening. That's not happening. People still need a place to gather with other people physically. So I don't know if that answers your query, Andrew, or you'd like to push back if you're good at that.
I think that's helpful, and
Go ahead.
I'd be inclined to agree with you, Bill, about virtual space. The other aspect there was those biblical passages are talking about the importance of place, but that could be anywhere, and it's worshiping in spirit and in truth, and Jesus dwelling amongst his people. And there's less there about the physical building than about co-location with people, I think.
Right, that's a good point. But I think I will probably come close to addressing that in the next part when we talk about the function of
Yes.
place.
So beautiful segue, Bill. Why don't you move into the pieces that you were wanting to share about the function of place?
All right, thank you. I will do that. So you had in the handout, if you have it there, you'll notice there are about 5 dimensions that I have pulled up. There could be many more too. But how does place function, and what is its role? And the first that I have suggested there is that place actually does and can and will influence people's actions, physical actions. It has been suggested that the average McDonald's restaurant is designed so that you will only want to stay there 13 minutes. They have done that by the material you sit on, the ambience, the noise level, and I say the food, but that's another thing. But they only want you there 13 minutes. On the other hand, my wife and I went to a restaurant in Calgary here for an anniversary. We were greeted by a hostess who did not say to us, "Enjoy your meal." She said, "Enjoy your evening." And they wanted us to stay there 3 hours, which we did. I had the opportunity to have an interview with a fellow named Scott Traeger, he was more or less in charge of the whole facilities of Willow Creek Church. And it was around the time that they moved from their 4,500 seat sanctuary into their 7,200 seat sanctuary. And I asked Scott this question: what do you want people to experience in this space? And he said there are 3 things. Number 1, we want them to slow down. They are situated outside Chicago. He said people live a frenetic life. So when they walk in there, we want them to slow down. Secondly, most importantly, we want them to encounter God. And thirdly, we want them to experience genuine community. So I asked him, are you telling me, Scott, that space can be designed in such a way that those 3 responses will happen? And he said, without question. It took us 7 years to design it in terms of lighting, materials, colors, proportions, distances, all those things. And when you consider the fact there's a difference of people, for example, going to Pittodrie Field, which is where the Aberdeen Dons play football, when people are walking in there, contrast that with when people walk into a cathedral, say Notre Dame Cathedral in Montreal. Totally different responses, totally different reactions. So space can and does influence action. So as a church, I say, so what do we want people to experience when they come into our buildings? Do we ever think about that? So secondly, I think the function of place and space is to create an identity. For the longest time, identity theories put a marked distinction between location and actual identity of people. But in recent studies, scholars have suggested there.
Hello?
Yes. I lost us here. Just 1 sec. Here, I'm coming back. Sorry. My battery died.
Pardon?
I thought I had plugged in. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So now what theorists are saying is that they suggest that all identifications, that is who we are, have location implications. In other words, place is a part of who I am. Last week, I was in Boston at a conference in a session. I said, and someone said this, where you are is who you are. I'm still working that one through. But I had a conversation also just yesterday with a good friend of mine, Mark Santa. I work with Aboriginal people, First Nations people. And there's something I think we can learn from our Indigenous neighbors. When they meet someone, they never ask the white question, what do you do? They ask, where are you from? And who's your grandfather? Where you are from is who you are. And the environment becomes a salient part of our identity as opposed to merely the context in which our identity is established. Now, that's going to vary for different people at different stages in life. And it seems that the longer we are associated with a given location, and I'm thinking specifically like a church building, then it seems the deeper goes the identity roots. And too often, I've been a part of the church building program. Too often when we relocate, we don't give people opportunity to grieve because it's not just that it's just bricks and mortar, because to them it is not just bricks and mortar. It's a part of who they are, who they have been, who their parents have been. It's a part of their identity. So when we relocate, which is maybe good and fine and should be happening, we need to be sensitive to where people are. Life occurs somewhere, and I said, and it occurred, and that somewhere is very important. So I need to hurry. Thirdly, place functions as a restorative environment. And I don't have time to get into this, but there's a whole body of literature, a whole area of theory called attention recovery theory. And they've discovered that, for example, people who work on assembly lines, monotonous, repetitive work, need a different kind of place. After a while, accidents happen because they become bored. They lose the capacity to attend. And so they need a different kind of environment. People who work in hospices, who are dealing with death all the time, need another kind of environment in which to recover the ability to attend and to reflect. And those are going to vary from person to person. But they are discovering the importance of the environment in the healing process. Recovery organizations, people who deal with addiction, recovery, alcoholism, they have discovered they hire environmental psychologists to design buildings. They've started to hire environmental psychologists in the designing of prisons because they've discovered that even the change in color in a holding cell can have a direct, radical impact on those who occupy those spaces. And I would argue that if we as a church are concerned about the wholeness of people's well-being, we better pay attention to the fact that when they come into our buildings are going to impact them. And what would a healing environment look like? I got to move on quickly. Fourthly, place also functions as a memory builder. Walter Brueggemann said, place is space which has historical meanings where some things have happened which are now remembered and which provide continuity and identity across generations. There was another gentleman named Philip Shelton who said, place is space that has the capacity to be remembered, to evoke what is most precious. I think every one of us could think of some place that to which we attach very significant memories. The place my wife and I were married is no longer there. It used to be Central Alliance Church on Bank Street in Ottawa. it's not there. At least it's not serving that. But I've got memories attached there. The Old Testament provides numerous examples of places that were designated to remember. And it wasn't just to remember what happened there when they put up the pillars of stones and your children ask you, what happened here? Tell them that God intervened in our space history. But it's also more about who you are, an identity of who you are. That, again, is my land is so important to indigenous peoples because their ancestors are there. They're buried there. And that's who they are. The way they are is who they are. So in many instances, the purpose of memorials supersedes the mere retention of historical fact. But it's a reminder of our identity. And then I think, lastly, the spaces, it tells a story. It tells a narrative. Narrative is conveyed through song, through art, through words. But I'm arguing that it also is conveyed through the built environment, through architecture. Richard Giles has said, the church's building is a commanding preacher, and no one should underestimate its power to communicate. Its message can linger on long after our words have died away. Church buildings have language. Church buildings tell stories. Church buildings have body language as much as we do as humans. And the challenge is, of course, we don't all speak the same language. And what we really intend, what an architect intends to convey to certain structures, someone else, we can't, it's like any written word you put out there. You put a silly message up on Facebook, which I'm not sure why you do that, anyways. But once it's out there, you have lost control of how people interpret it. And they might interpret it so terribly wrong. The reality is, our buildings can do the same thing. What that means for me is I need to, if I'm going to be part of a group that is putting up a church building, do I know the vernacular of that community where that church is going to be planted? Because it might not be the same as where we moved from. So let me stop there. I've taken more of my time.
Wonderful. Great, thank you. Lots of wonderful stuff there. So I wonder if folk have anything in particular that caught your attention in what Bill was sharing, that you just kind of went, wow, that's so true. I invite you to speak to that if you had such a moment.
I'd love to chip in.
Go
Thank
ahead,
you very
Bill.
much. And actually, I'm sorry I had connection problems before. In order to make this time, I had to be in not one place. And then as that was being spoken out, I felt like I was committing a sin. And I'm here in the Apple store where I have to be. There we go. There's the Apple store there, which is relevant to my point. I'm concerned that we're asking these questions from too far within the church. And I'm speaking as a minister who's been planted 4 churches into historic church buildings. I love my Anglican church I'm part of. I love our location. We're 10 seconds from this store, just down the road, very near the cathedral you mentioned in Montreal. How can we ask these questions about how the world well outside of the church sees sacred space and sees place and sees all those things? And to what extent can we ask the question from their perspective first? To me, this is a purely missional question, because anything that we want to talk about with sacred space, it's partly important if God cares. You know, if God really cares about the way we do things, that's very important. But I think God cares more about us bringing people into those spaces. So if they don't come, whatever we've done within those spaces is irrelevant. So my question is, and let me tell you my solution, but then I'll leave you with it because we've only got a couple of minutes left. I think we need to be opening community centers with multiple expressions of church and community within these buildings. That's the way the space becomes sacred, and then declare it sacred in those different things. So the AA groups that meet, the concerts, these things that may seem secular, how can we make them sacred by being in our spaces, but actually engaging with them in that way? So what I'm saying is, how can we deeply and radically rethink our use of space. The way the world sees our spaces more than we see them in the church. I think actually we'll find deeper missional content. That's certainly been my experience. Find more opportunities to speak about obviously Jesus things when we start from that direction. That's my 2 cents.
Great, thank you, Graham. Bill, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, so good, Graham. Thank you so much for that. Your question raises the issue that I think it confronts us as the church. How do we know what people outside the church think and believe if we're not talking to them? If we are expecting them to come onto our home ice all the time, but we don't go out onto their home ice with our ears open and our mouths shut, how on earth are we going to come to understand what's important to them? My good friend and colleague Joel Thiessen, who's part of our conversation, we wrote an article together where we basically brought our dissertations together. Joel's done work with the Nons and the marginal affiliates. And what he discovered, and correct me if I'm wrong, Joel, you'll jump in there. He discovered that among the people that we as a church are ostensibly hoping to reach out to, and we want to create what we have called a safe space, whatever the heck that is. Safe space. We have apparently taken that to mean no symbols, because they're offensive. And yet, I think among other things, what Joel discovered is among the marginal affiliates, when they come to church, they don't want their kids to get married in a warehouse or a gym. They want their kids to get married in a church. And I think sometimes we don't know people outside the church, like Graham has suggested. We don't know who they are for the simple reason we're not talking to them. We're not listening to them. We're not listening, giving them a chance to say, like, this would be really important. This is what I think. This is what I'm anticipating. This is what I would hope for. But if we're not listening to them, folks, then we're building according to our imaginations, and that's a scary thing. So let me stop there, Graham. That was just a great question. I'm going to be working on that even more.
Great. Any other resonances or things that are kind of rising for folk through this conversation?
Yeah, I've got a question for Bill, actually. How do you initiate that shift in paradigm, though? Because I'm coming into a church where, and nothing against the pastor that was here before, but he was here for 25 years. And the congregation is set in that 25-year program. And you come into the situation where you're looking at it going, we need to shift our paradigm from being that holier than thou aspect on a main avenue to a community aspect. And people don't want to come in because they see the whole design of the outside is very church. But if you go inside the church, it's very much community and relationship. And you can't go overboard or too quickly on the outside, because there's so many people holding on to that concept of what the church is supposed to look like. Where in reality, you go back to the original, and church was a kitchen table. And some of the fastest growing churches, like in China, the underground movements, are in underground, in homes, in living rooms, in kitchens. How do you get the mentality of the congregation to shift?
Go ahead, Bill.
Very slowly. I think it's we have to be patient and allow people to process things. I have to remind myself, I have to be patient because I've been working on this for 17 years. So it's on my front burner all the time. So when people don't get what I'm trying to say or don't agree with what I'm trying to say, that's good. At least they're going to be thinking. And I don't expect all of you wonderful folks here today to agree with everything. But I think in answer to your question, Todd, that takes time. And I think as church leaders, we need to allow people the room and the space and the time to get used to some ideas, to process them, to even contribute to it. And that's not going to, and sometimes I think it will depend on the context, but that's not going to happen typically very quickly.
Great.
I'd like to feed back on that, but I don't want to cut off other people. But if there is an opportunity to feed back, I'd love to.
And who was speaking?
That's
Graham again. So I want to give space to others, and then if there's still want to hear what I'm going to say, I'm happy to chip back in.
Okay. So any other questions or go ahead, Linda.
It's actually Monica, but
Hi, Monica.
Linda and I are together. Yeah. So one of the things that Todd made me think about too is that where do people find sacredness in our world? A lot of the time is in the natural environment. So how our spaces interact with the environs around them, I think, is very important. So in our small group, we talked about in a church that I was at that we took out the windows took out the wall between the garden and the sanctuary space and put in windows, so that it was based on a Celtic theology that there's two gospels, the one that's written down and the one that's in the natural world. And so I think that that's something to really think about too. If we want people to experience sacredness when they come in, then we have to find ways to bring the outside into our building.
Any other questions or resonances that are happening for you in this conversation? Daniel, can you unmute yourself? There you go.
Sorry, I had two comments and maybe a question. I'm looking at what is everybody's saying is there's a tension between understanding how to be relevant in a community with space and multifunctionality, and yet also show distinction in its relevance and purpose as a leader or a leadership of a community in trying to engage that community as a spiritual leader. Like if you're looking at, like, I got married in a church that that looks like a church, not a warehouse. And that's the paradigm that I'm talking about. And then having a warehouse that actually works for others to come into. I do a lot of children's ministry work, and my last comment's this: the understanding of leadership strategy and trying to accommodate all those tensions comes down to circles and rows and how we run children's ministry. A circle is a small group, and a row is being in a large group and engaging the large group in a relevant way. I guess my question's this: how do you balance the tension of sacredness as well as functionality and still have soul in the building?
Thanks, Daniel. I've come to believe that I don't think functionality needs to be mutually exclusive to sacrality. I don't think sacredness and function are automatically on opposite ends of the spectrum. And I think that's where our problem is. And I think that's a Western way of thinking particularly, because we dichotomize our whole life. Forgive me for referring back to our indigenous peoples, but I've just been teaching about it in the class. For them, their spirituality is their life. They don't dichotomize. Their dream world, their spiritual world, their hunting world, their relational world, their family world, it's all one. It's all one. And that's very Hebrew. That's very Jewish, Old Testament. And we are much more in our Greek way of thinking, willing to dichotomize. And so we separate function from sacredness and say that it's either got to be sacred or functional. I'm saying that's the wrong statement. Functional can be very sacred, and sacred can be very functional. But we have to be intentional about that. We have to be thoughtful about that. We have to maybe redefine in our own minds, what do we mean by sacred? What is sacred? the comment that everything is sacred, I don't buy that, because by definition, you cannot have sacred without the profane. Sacred is not the profane, and if there's no profane, there's no sacred. So Richard Iliadi wrote about the sacred and the profane, and we have sacred because there's profane, and not profane as an icky bad profanity, but ordinary. Ordinary. Sacred is that which is out of the ordinary. And I think there is a place for sacred space that is out of the ordinary. And it might be in the same space, place, location as the mundane. And I love to think that sacred invades the mundane. That's the beauty of the Celtic thing. You were saying about sacred, about the Celtic spirituality. They talk about thin places, and a glass is like that membrane between where we live and where the other world is. And I think our church buildings can reflect that. Anyway, I yabbered.
Great. So I'm feeling the abundance of our conversation today. So much good ideas and just the beginnings of things. It feels a little bit, Bill, like you've we're like fertile soil, and you've sprinkled all these seeds that are going out and taking root and are going to blossom into further thoughts and thinking and perhaps actions and perhaps prayer. So thank you so much for that. I'd love for us to find a way to close our time together. And I would invite people to say just kind of one word that stands out that you're leaving, that you're taking away from this time together. A word or a statement or a sentence, just one short kind of piece to kind of express either your appreciation or your value of what's happened. So, Gloria, would you like to start? You need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I always call the wrong microphone first. And my one word is wholeness.
Thank you. Todd?
I would just say thankfulness for this group.
Thank you. Andrew?
I'll go with intentional awareness, a big hyphenated word.
Great, thank you. Ryan?
I guess maybe the thing that stuck out the most to me is the idea of identity.
Okay, great, thank you. Bob?
Oh, there's lots. There's too much for one word. Appreciated stimulating the conversation, even in my brain.
Thank you. Linda and her friend whose name I don't have. You can unmute yourself there.
I guess just spaciousness. But Linda, what do you want to?
Experience.
Great, thank you. James?
I would say I would say sacredness versus functionality, and I don't mean that in the sense of like either or. I just would say the comparison of the two and how they interact. I think that's something that's jumped out at me.
Wonderful. Daniel?
I'm kind of torn between creating of identity or restorative environments.
Lots of richness there. Thank you. Yeah. Heath?
I think I like what Bill said when he talked about what does your home say about you as much as what does your church say about us.
Great, thank you. Martin? Martin, would you like to share? Okay, I'll move on to Joel then.
I'll just say, Bill, you're great, and thanks everyone for being part of this conversation. It's just been really enriching for me.
And Andrea, I don't think you have a mic? Okay, you can type yours if you want. Nice to see you. And Darcia, looks like she's gone. Arch?
Thanks, Bill. Less dichotomy, and this has been great. I think I'm up next. So anyways, good.
Graham?
I think it's urgency. I love that we're doing this, and I wish we could do more. And I don't think we have time for the 17 years anymore. I think it's time we need to step up the pace on this. And I think we need to be honest that many of the congregations holding these spaces just aren't able to handle the pace that we need.
Great, thank you, Graham. Wendy? Or Amanda, would you like to check out? So story from Wendy, thank you. Okay, well, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much, everybody, for participating in this call. And you'll be receiving a survey, which will invite you to give us some feedback about your experience of this and help us to kind of tweak this along the way as we're doing it. We have a couple more that are being planned. So we'll look forward to getting that feedback. And again, thank you so much, Bill. It's been a pleasure doing this with you. And I hope we'll be able to find ways to continue this dialogue. It feels really important. So take care and have the rest of your day.
Thank you, folks.
Bye-bye.